The flooding events of November 2021, yeah, that's a really a question that could have a lot of answers. But first of all, we have never witnessed flood events, number one, and then we did have flood events in 1990, but we didn't have anything called atmospheric rivers. So that was a new terminology for all of us. And we didn't know what the extent of those would be, because we did see them in 1990, but not to this kind of extent in 2021. At the end of the day, we had major flooding and a little more than what we'd seen in 1990, but it was way quicker. It happened in such a speed that the nation had to try and be ready and prepared, but you don't really prepare for things like that in just 2 or 3 days. So, long story short, it happened so quickly. Within 3 days, we've seen the atmospheric rains come in, and in that time, we've seen kind of, I don't know if I'd call it destruction, but what Mother Nature brought to us in terms of a situation where we had to be ready and responsive for our nation and make sure the safety, number one, of our community was there, and then try and figure out a way forward after the flood event itself. The event itself was gradual at the beginning, and I would say it started on Monday, if I recall correctly, and by Wednesday it was just about to a point where I could, well, actually by Wednesday my son launched a boat from my yard, and so it was that quick of a moment. And the reason we had to launch is because we had fishing equipment. We had my wife's farm, well, mini farm of 2 horses to take care of, and that equipment, because the rain and water came in so quickly, we couldn't get it up to higher ground right away. We actually didn't think it was going to come that quickly. We would have had a chance to, take care of it. But anyways, that was the event for my particular place and location. But in and amongst the community situation, what happened is that, again, it happened so quickly we weren't ready for it. But when it did happen, there was so much going on. There was media releases going on. There was our own internal information. We were getting information from the city and the province, which was critical because we could get real-time information about the elevations and how quickly they were going to come at us. And even with the knowledge that we had when it actually happened, it was even more surprising than we expected. And so I still recall one evening as I had brought all of my equipment and belongings, which I thought was to higher ground. That very night, on the Tuesday night, they informed us that the Barrowtown pump station was going to go down, one of the pumps or some of the pumps. And that apparently was a false rumor, but it was rampant through our nation because it was on the media or somebody had picked it up. And so here we are trying to relax that evening after taking all of our equipment and trailers and things to higher ground. And then one of our nation and community members phones me as a council member and says, and our chief as well, and says, look, we've got 10 or 15 people down by the water and we're waiting for, the floodgates sound like they're going to open because the pump station's going to malfunction. And we're really afraid for the nation and the houses, right? And so that relaxation became more of a frenzy, trying to address, first of all, our nation's concerns. And so immediately what we did is we phoned the city and the province. We said, look, what's going on with the pump station? And they said, yeah, it was faltering a bit, but it seems to be okay now. And so that alleviated our community members' emergency thoughts at that point. So that was the situation at the time. It was pretty highly elevated as far as the emergency seemed. Yeah. And that was at probably the cresting of the lake. But that night, both I and Chief Silver were on watch. We stayed probably every second hour. We were checking the water levels to see if in fact it was going to crest and flood the rest of our community. It didn't. We were lucky. We had one house which was in the floodplain originally anyways, and it incurred some damage, but we were going to take it down anyways. It's had other situations going on with it. So we were pretty lucky as a nation. We're talking about traditional territories and the history of the Sumas Hoekstra, we call it. That's lake in our language, Helkamilam. And so if we go back in history, if you want to go that far back, 1924 is when it was drained. It took several attempts at the local jurisdiction in the province to drain it, probably from 1920 to 1924. And when it happened originally, our leadership of the day, our chief, actually didn't think they could do it. That was a massive lake, 36,000 acres, that they didn't believe could be drained. So you can imagine the interaction between our leadership and our community back then, having government coming saying we're gonna drain the lake, and you know, we're gonna make it into farmland, and our people didn't believe it could happen. And then as it started to happen, they realized what was actually happening and what it would mean to them, because it had all of the resources, it had all of the five Pacific salmon species in it. Of course, all the wildlife that you know, relied on it as well. And so essentially what they were doing is they were removing our food security, our ability to travel. And what's better than just going out to lakefront and getting the food that you need? So that's a little bit of the history. And if we fast forward to what happened within our territories here, again, when we think about it as a disaster, many people think, oh man, that was horrible, right? Well, I had a chance to sit down with the lake one evening, and I thought, yeah, it was threatening to take my place that evening. And would I allow it to? And if I asked that question of myself and my family, we would probably say yes. Let's take the lake back. And everything that comes with it, the resources, the fish, the wildlife, the birds, because they've relied upon it for years, right? And so what we have left is what you see here, is the Sumas River. And of course the tributaries that fill it too, but it's not the same as having a lake. So, you know, as we look forward, would we like some of the lake back? I think so. We'd like to have some of it back, not just for ourselves, but as I mentioned, for the resource, for the fish and others. Yeah. There's a portion of the lake just over the other side of the dike, and so it's a gentle reminder that it's still here. The spirit of the lake is still here. And at any point, Mother Nature may have her way with us and return it to us, right? And so the way forward, that's a real loaded question, because we have empathy for the people that are living in the lake bottom today, in the bottom, well, Sumas Prairie, more commonly known. But we've always known it as the lake bottom. And other people drive through it. Number 1 highway goes through it. And people are completely oblivious to the fact that there's a lake here, or was a lake here. And so, you know, when we say we'd like Sumas back, that could create a lot of controversy with the local jurisdiction, the city of Abbotsford, as well as their constituents, the farming community. And many of those people are family and friends that we've gone to school with, right? So we've got to be really careful about how we share that information. And I would suggest we're not looking for the lake to be completely back, but what we're looking for likely is to have some of the resources associated with it. And that might mean bringing back some of the waterways to do that, opening up some of the waterways that have been blocked for years. And so, you know, that's the one thing that's occurring now is governments moving on a schedule that we can't keep up to, because they've got a schedule, they've got deliverables, they've got timelines, and they've got money to try and implement something to protect the socioeconomic factors, the infrastructure that's in the territory here. It's been established over time. And so that's our challenge, is to harmonize our thinking of trying to maintain what we had before, or a portion of what we had before in Sumas Hoekstra, and allowing the local jurisdiction to make sure that they can accommodate their constituents, the farming community, and others, right? Emergency Planning Secretariat is a relatively new organization, and interestingly enough, the organization I work for is the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance. And so it's housed temporarily under our organization, but we hope that it will become an independent, self-sustaining secretariat and agency moving forward. And so it's been established in a way to ensure 31 First Nations from the mouth of the Fraser up to Yale are involved with anything relevant to emergencies, such as the flood events that we had and flood recovery. And so we're really hopeful that government will recognize that, because right now it's not funded fully. We're having to go out and find funding, hopefully multi-year funding, that will sustain the organization, because we really need something in place where nations like Sumas, others that were impacted by the flood, or who knows if we have an earthquake in the future, or a tsunami, or whatever it might be, that we have an ability to have central organization to support nations.
Yeah, there's some nations that are outside the dikes even. I think we talked about like in Chilliwack and
Katie? Yeah.
That seems like there's a lot of work to do to sort of figure all of that out too.
Was that a question?
No, sorry.
Just a general comment. Yeah, there's lots of that.
Yeah.
And you'll see that because if you look at freeways, you'll see trains, train tracks, and diking. You'll see a lot of the nations are very close to those, or as you've mentioned, you know, they don't have the protection because they've situated the reserves on the riverside versus being on the protected side. Yeah.
Abbotsford's come up with a plan that could be up to like $2.8 billion. If you look at, you know, up the Fraser Valley or down, there's other ones, you know, it's 150 million, you know, Chilliwack has, you know, partnered with some First Nations and they're doing something, but there's a whole bunch of other stretch of dike that they don't do.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't only include dikes, it includes like maybe increasing waterways and stuff like that. But all of this is like, you know, billions and billions of dollars. We've been also doing this on the wildfire front, you know, so that's a little bit more in the interior, but there's also got a price tag if you really want to protect communities. It's billions of dollars.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, who should pay, you know, and like how do you prioritize like what should happen, you know, and I mean, you know, and you know, should First Nations be part of that discussion?
So, a question about funding and the investments from the respective governments, the province and the feds. So the feds sound like they're about $5 billion investment, and the province, the last I heard, is about $1.8 billion. So is that enough to rectify the situation in the province? Probably not. Because as you've mentioned, the city of Abbotsford is $2.4 to $2.8 billion investment. And that's based on their view on what should happen through Build Back Better. And that's the challenge, right? Because there hasn't been an opportunity for our nation or nations that may be affected by the city of Abbotsford's proposals to engage, to talk about this Build Back Better is for, you know, diking infrastructure to elevate the dike. It's for building back the Barrowtown pump station. Maybe they're going to double the pumps, I'm not sure. But we've seen some of the proposals. We're not necessarily happy with them, but we're the one thing I guess we would acknowledge is they put something together at least, and perhaps something for a basis to talk about and work with. Does it meet our Sumas interests? No, not at this point, because we just haven't had the time. The thing that occurs is it's driven by government, number one. Funding becomes a frenzy because everybody wants a piece of the pie, and the city of Abbotsford should have a piece of the pie, just like Merritt and Princeton and others. But how do you share that broadly to get the best return on investment for each of those cities, each of those jurisdictions, right? And that's the challenge. And so if you're only going to be allotted a certain amount of money, you better do it right the first time as best you can. And so that's our view, and you know, our view is kind of very much worldview. We think 7 generations past, 7 generations forward as best as you can. And for me, that's a real challenge. You know, today for me, that's a real challenge to think that far back and that far forward. But we have to task ourselves with that, not only for ourselves, but the future generations, but also the resource, the water. If you look at this water right now, you used to be able to swim in this. You could see the bottom of it clearly. And they used to have Hogan Park days just down the road here. The city of Abbotsford used to host those. Everybody would be in the water. I wouldn't be swimming in there too often, you know. And those are the kinds of things we're really looking at in terms of Build Back Better situations. What can we do for the resource? Water is a huge resource in our territory. We have mining that's occurring. There's 8 or 9 mines on the top of Sumas Mountain. So aside from, you know, things that are occurring like flood events and atmospheric rivers and who knows with climate change, there's many other aspects we have to look at, right?